Hi, my name is Shelomo Solson, youth motivational speaker, author of the teen mental health book, Never Fight Alone, and host of this podcast, Teenage Impact, where my entire mission is to inspire you to overcome challenges in your life and achieve excellence. Before I continue and introduce my guest of the podcast, if you haven't checked out my book, Never Fight Alone, it's been out for about 6 months now, where I have compiled 51 of these inspiring interviews. Go ahead, check it out. The link is in the bio. Now, I want to introduce a very special guest, my first interview in a while. Her name is Jennifer Litner. Now, Jennifer, she's a certified sex therapist and a human sexuality educator. She helps people who want a more vibrant sex life to speak openly, deepen their connection, and love energetically because she believes that you deserve to be sexually satisfied. Jennifer believes the sex life you desire is worth striving for. She also helps adults and teens overcome this awkward conversation and have more open conversations about sex. Today, she's going to go over why sex education is important. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for having me today, Shlomo.
Now, Jennifer is right now in Chicago. It's not snowing right now, is it?
No, it's not. All the snow just melted.
You know, I've been living in Philly for about over a year, and there's been quite a few snowstorms in the past few months, and my electricity bill, I will tell you, it is pretty high.
Yeah, the Northeast can get a lot of snow as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jennifer, how long have you been doing this for?
Yeah, I've been in the field for about a little over 10 years now. I started doing more public health, pure health education, then went into the therapy field, and then went back into get another degree in education. So I've sort of had my hand and foot in different places, as so to speak, relating to both education and psychotherapy in the field of sexual health.
Why do you think sex education is important for adults, for teens, and for, to have those conversations together? Why do you think that is important?
Yeah, well, it's so important because it informs pretty much a lot of how we live our lives. Sexuality is this really broad thing. It's not necessarily what we do with our partners or we do with ourselves in terms of sexual exploration, but it's also how we identify, how we live in the world, how we interact with others. It informs, how our body works when it comes to going through puberty and reproduction, as well as many other things. So, being informed about sexual health and sexuality is sort of like being informed about how to drive a car, right? Like if at some point you're going to need a driver's license if you're going to want to operate it, and you're going to have to go to driver's education, and we prioritize that in our society, but how come we don't prioritize sexuality education? It's sort of a necessary piece that no matter how one identifies, it's important to understand these things that are going to be within your body and within other people that are going on, and it's really vital to us as human beings.
Mm-hmm. And who do you mainly target?
So I work with a number of people, predominantly in my therapy practice. I work with a lot of couples and individual adults. And then I work a lot with parents and teens and healthcare providers in education spaces. I also train and help teach in master's and doctorate level programs for clinicians who are students who are studying to become therapists. So those are the populations that I tend to work with most.
I'm sure you get some objections when trying to work with different individuals. What are some of those objections, and how do you typically get over them?
Yeah, I think one thing that I didn't realize as early on, but is something that's become really apparent now, is you really have to have thick skin in a way, or I think of like an armor right over yourself when you work in the sexuality field, because so many people can be really hateful and rude, and thinking that, you know, your intentions around education are going to, whether it be corrupt their children or is going to be negative in some way. And I think for me, some of the things that I've learned is that a lot of times people are really, there's a lot of fear around what they might, if they had this education, what that might do for them, or shame that's kind of been passed on through a lot of messages, whether it be culturally or throughout their development in some way. And I am someone who really believes in centering people's experiences in all of their aspects of their identity, and understanding, right, where does, you know, what is accurate and what is not, right? And so understanding both the science piece of it and also understanding, you know, some of the messages that people hold on to that may or may not be serving them. So I think it's challenging, but, you know, I've really developed that armor, and I think that helps me navigate the world better.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree because, you know, I come from an Indian background. Parents, obviously, in the Asian culture, they don't open up to their kids about sex, sexuality. A lot of times, students have to experiment that on themselves and have to learn it from others, possibly maybe at school, maybe from their friends, maybe from other adults, but they don't really have that open conversation with their parents because, first of all, parents think it's inappropriate to learn at such a young age, and it's just awkward for both parties. So when you are dealing with parents, or if you're talking to a parent right now, how do you get rid of that awkward conversation to have with your teenage child?
Yeah. So I think one of the things is to accept that awkwardness is going to happen, particularly if you are taught that if this is not something you're going to talk about, or it could be uncomfortable. Awkwardness is just an emotion, just like any other emotion. And I think about emotions like crayons in a crayon box, right? Every color that's in that box is there for a reason, and we might not like all the crayons equally. But if we're, you know, completing a drawing, we probably need to use them all. So normalizing that awkwardness is going to be just present, and then gaining some practice. So I often have people, you know, come up with what they would want to share with their child, and then go practice it with another adult or practice it in the mirror. And once you've said this a couple of times, you're like, okay, like I've rehearsed this. I feel a little bit more prepared, and the awkwardness might still be there, but you'll feel a little bit more efficacious or more confident in having that conversation.
What age would you recommend having those conversations?
Well, so you can start sex ed is like really broad, but when we talk about bodies and health and consent and touch, those are conversations that you can have with a 3-year-old. So it's even 2-year-old, right? Like knowing like what is safe touch, what is unsafe touch, when they go to the doctor, right? Having consent around diaper changes, things like that, you know, and toddlers leading up to, you know, around 2, 3, sometimes they're no longer in diapers. So really understanding like that from a young age, they can start to have these conversations, and it's not necessarily about sex. It's about other things that impact healthy relationships, right? And throughout the lifespan, what you would do is just be a little bit more specific and give developmentally appropriate information, right? And that's the key.
Mm-hmm. What are the do's and don'ts when having the talk with your teenage child?
Yeah. So I think do practice active listening, right?
Okay.
Hear where they're at, listen to their questions, and make time for conversations related to healthy relationships. Make time for conversations around bodies, development, and identity. Make sure you're really focusing on the different topics that are necessary for them to learn. Get a sense of what their education may or may not cover in school. I know people's sex ed has shifted a bit in pandemic times. Everybody's education has shifted.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding like what they will be learning, what they won't be, and also providing developmentally appropriate resources. So, going to the library and checking out a book or purchasing a book, if you have the means to do that, is a great way to help read with your child, or to schedule time to check in. Things not to do. First of all, like a lot of times we have this like reaction to something when somebody asks us a question. And the first thing we do is like unload that reaction without having like a processing of what it is that's happening internally. So really kind of managing your own reactions to what your child's asking, right? So if a 5-year-old's like asking about, well, what is a condom? They probably heard that word somewhere and they're asking about what it means. They probably don't know what the context is. And so when parents and caregivers hear that, sometimes they feel like, oh my gosh, my kid is, over sexualized. No, they're just curious, right? So being able to manage your reactions and really respond from a place of compassion and understanding, answering the question they're asking. Sometimes parents want to explain like everything at once. It's like, no, they just want to know what a condom is, right? A condom is a barrier, right? That could be enough of an answer. So really being intentional there, not shaming your child by any means for any questions they ask. And also, really being, I think, thoughtful. This is sort of a do and don't about creating space for them to come to you. And perhaps if and when they don't feel comfortable coming to you, another adult that you trust that they would feel more comfortable going to. So I think those are some starter tips, that do's and don'ts.
Mm-hmm. Both of us, we probably were raised when growing up. We didn't have, YouTube. We didn't have social media. I mean, social media really started taking off when I was in college or end of high school. But we didn't have easy access to internet like the kids do nowadays. I have 5 nieces and nephews, so I see they're on their phone, they go on YouTube, they look up stuff, and they will see stuff. Would you recommend having certain type of content blockers so they don't hear certain inappropriate things?
Yeah, I think using parental controls, right? I think that's a lot of times what they're called, but like using those content blockers or parental controls on media is a good thing to do. But I think what's also very important is teaching children about what's called media literacy. And media literacy is a concept that basically helps kids understand when they're seeing something on the media, whether it be explicit or not, right? Having an understanding of who created this advertisement or this commercial, right? So like who funds it impacts things. We think about this with research too. What was the message that they're trying to send? Does this like feel like it's replicated or applicable to everybody or just a certain type of person, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And so really kind of being able to unpack the media that they're consuming. And questions could start like, how do you think it feels to watch this? How do you think, it feels for me to watch this versus you versus your sibling or whoever? We're getting them to kind of bring in this social emotional learning with what they're consuming is a really important step, because ultimately what that will help you lead to a conversation about is developing realistic expectations. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what's fed to us via media is not that realistic. And so I think that's a good message to start with.
And you've touched base on this a little bit throughout this podcast, but just to go a little bit deeper, what topics fall under sexual education and what age range do you feel is appropriate for each topic?
There's a number of concepts that fall under comprehensive sexuality education, but we talk about anatomy and physiology, mm-hmm. talking about consent and boundaries and privacy, talking about media literacy like we discussed, talking about healthy relationships, what is healthy, what is not, preventing childhood sexual abuse and things like that, and wanting kids to understand that, identity, both like sexual and romantic orientation, as well as the gender identity and expansiveness. So different types of relationships. There's also like prevention of STIs and HIV and unintended pregnancies and pieces around reproduction. So there's a whole lot of, I could go on and on and on, but there's a number of topics, and many of these are not actually related to sex itself. And so I think it's much broader, thinking of it as like, sometimes as referred to as sex and relationship education. And like I mentioned before, really just being thoughtful about the what you're sharing and when. We can really think about the timeline for that, really starting with being able to talk with young children about like consent and safe touch, bodies and health as they're younger, working into talking about puberty and what to expect and kind of physical changes, having crushes, like those are things you would talk about in late elementary into middle school, being able to talk about protection and from STIs and contraceptive methods as they're in middle school into high school. And then, it's the complexity of things increase as they get older. So it's not so much you're kind of pulling themes from each of these topics, but you're sharing what's developmentally appropriate. So it's often like smaller phrases of things, and then you expand on the definition as they're older and talk about it in a more nuanced way. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a long process. It's not one conversation, it's many conversations.
What resources are available? You've mentioned the library. Are there particular books, organizations you should go to, particular websites you should visit? What resources are available for both teachers, parents, and teenagers?
Yes. One resource that actually I created is called Building Ease, talking about the birds and the bees, which is an online course for parents and caregivers who want to learn how to kind of manage the awkwardness and be able to share and educate their children on these important topics. And they can find that on our website or going to buildingease.embracesexualwellness.com. The other resources, Advocates for Youth and SECUS, which are two larger organizations, they have a lot of resources there, both for educators as well as caregivers. Amaze.org has lovely videos that are animated and great to share with children, and they're developmentally appropriate. So they're short, like mini clips. Scarletine is a fabulous resource for teens. And I have a number of resources and books that are also in the Building Ease program. We have a library, but also on our website. So if you go to embracesexualwellness.com, on our resources page, we have a number of those linked too.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked a lot about tips for adults. Now, let's go into tips for teens.
Yeah.
If you come from a background like I did in an Asian culture where it's kind of parents don't open up to you, you don't really know much about it, how can you take the lead on opening up those conversations with your parents and your loved ones?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think, it's going to vary from teen to teen based on your family history and how or culturally in your family it's addressed. But I think, being able to say, I'm looking for resources on how to learn about my body as it's changing. For example, like, can you help me? Can we look together, right? Where would you recommend we go? That might be one question to ask a caregiver. Now, for some teens, they're not going to feel comfortable going to their parents, and I totally understand that. I think the best thing to do would be, do you have access to a library? Are there books in your library that you can check out? That's a great place. You can also, like I said, go to scarletine.org. I think connecting with sexuality educators, resources can be great, but really I would prefer that for teens to find a trusted adult, to whether it be a teacher, their parent or caregiver, or someone else in the family that they, even if it's an older sibling, and saying, I'm really trying to understand more about, gender identity, or really I want to understand how does the body work? What is a period? What is menstruation? Those are important questions that kids will need to learn about. And so finding a trusted adult is a good step.
Mm-hmm. How do you handle insecurities and feel like you don't know anything compared to your peers?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think a lot of us feel insecure throughout our lives, and it's normal as a teenager to feel insecure, because you're figuring out who you are and your identity is consistently developing. And so first, like, recognizing that you're not alone, right? That feeling insecure is about feeling unsure, and that we develop certainty through experience. So I remember listening to your podcast about making failure being nothing is a good thing. And I think about how, a lot of times I think as an educator, through error activated learning, so this process of, we're going to make mistakes, we're not going to know it all, and we're going to learn from it, and that's okay, and that's actually a good thing. And so just reminding oneself that, like, even though you don't feel secure now, doesn't mean you're always going to feel this way. And maybe asking, what would help me feel more secure in this moment? What could I do? Maybe it's telling myself that, or telling yourself that, today this feels really uncomfortable, but it's not going to be forever. Or maybe it's, can I find a resource, or go do some research on this topic, or can I talk to a friend or a caregiver about what I'm dealing with? And I think those are some things that I would encourage people to do.
Mm-hmm. Great tips. And so I'm going to ask one last question, but I'm going to break it down to 3 different audiences.
Okay.
If you can write like a 3-step action plan for first parents, then educators at schools, and then young adults, what would that 3-step plan be for each one of those individuals?
Okay. And the 3-step plan for just related to sex ed, or?
Sex ed, increasing your knowledge, or discussing with your teenager, or discussing with an adult. If there is a 3-step plan, what would it be?
So for parents and caregivers, I think the first thing we need to do is understand our own biases. And I think of them as sexual scripts, but basically our ideas and messages that we carry about sex and our values. Understanding, getting really clear on what those are, because that impacts how you're going to show up. Educating yourself, finding resources, and being able to practice using some of those resources before you're interacting with your kiddos. For educators, first step would be really understand what is within the realm of your curriculum. Sometimes there are restrictions on what educators can provide, but understanding, what that curriculum entails, and if it's truly in line with comprehensive sex ed, or does it need to be, is there ways for modification? Like, what is kind of your role there? Being able to be a role model to kids, right? As an educator, I think the best thing you can do is just be able to hold space for questions, not being judgmental, normalizing that all questions are good questions, because teens young people need a place to go to ask those questions, and they may not be able to at home. And then, the third step I would say is to continue your learning, right? A lot of times, sometimes educators are well trained to specifically teach sex ed, and sometimes they're not. And really making sure that you feel educated and well trained and suitable to be teaching this. If your value systems get in the way of being able to teach sex ed, then that's going to impact the quality of the programming. So those are my 3 tips for educators. And then for teens, I think, really just being patient with yourself. You're developing, and young people are developing so much, and just knowing that sexuality is fluid. It is something that evolves in time, just like other aspects of your identity. You may identify one way at one point in time. A year later, that may change. That's okay. So being patient with yourself. Again, not being afraid to ask the questions that you need to ask, and look for do some research and connect with the resources that you need. And I think third, just being really compassionate to yourself and to others. Sexuality is a broad topic. It can be complicated. It can be really enriching, but just knowing that it in general, it can be this positive thing, but it's important to be compassionate to yourself as you're learning, and to others, like not to judge others around you, because that can be the hardest part, is when we feel judged by our peers.
Mm-hmm. That's extremely important, because I know, speaking from personal experience,
Yeah.
I always felt like I was judged. I always considered myself really not really knowledgeable up until I started when I turned 18 in college, and I was learning from my peers, because I felt like I didn't have those open conversations, not only with my family members, but other people around me, because I thought, that was only an adult conversation to have, which is why I never asked or opened up to anyone. And of course, YouTube and Google wasn't used as an educational resource back then. When I was in high school. I didn't even have a laptop. We had those desktop computers for each family. One last question. My whole brand is based off of resiliency. My presentations I provide to school is about resiliency. My podcast is about resiliency. How would you tie in, and this may be a tough question, but how would you tie in sex education with resiliency?
Well, I think, far too often sex ed gets a bad rap, because I think that it's all about, a lot of times public health initiatives have taught us that we need to try to avoid things that are harmful. And that's been a lot of what some sex ed has focused on. And I think that what's more important in terms of resiliency is thinking about, if we can teach people, and I mean not just children, teens, but adults, everyone is more informed about sexuality and their bodies and how things work and their identities, right? That can actually enhance resiliency and have the ability to potentially really increase our satisfaction in our relationships and our well-being. It can make us have greater ease in the world, right? And I think that's something that all of us want, right? Is we want to be able to connect with other humans. We want to feel more confident in ourselves. And that's really what my research is all about. But I've seen this happen in my therapy office and with clients I've worked with in educational settings too. So my hope is that in order to be a resilient sexual being, right, that also means being informed, being aware, right, and being really, really kind and patient with yourself as you're on your learning journey.
Good point, because when you're more educated, you're able to implement some of those practices. And when you're able to implement some of those practices, you're going to have a higher quality life. And when you have a higher quality life, you will be more fulfilled. And when you're more fulfilled, you're able to overcome some of those challenges that you're facing in life. So great point. And Jennifer, where can people find you?
Yeah, so they can find me at embracesexualwellness.com or Embrace Sexual Wellness on Instagram and Facebook. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions, or we have some resources, and I'm sure we'll link to the podcast when it comes out.
Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in to Teenage Impact. If you're tuning in for the first time, go ahead, subscribe to Teenage Impact, rate and review, because I'm trying to impact as many people as possible. So go ahead, like, comment on YouTube, rate and review if you're on Apple Podcasts. And so until next time, thank you for tuning in. Peace.